Hey everyone, it's Mark, and this is Article Club, where this month we're discussing The Key by Brian Broome. It's not a secret to anybody, really, that I love Mr. Broome's writing, and his book, Punch Me Up to the Gods, where the key comes from, well, it's outstanding, and you should get it immediately, and you should read it, and then we should talk about it. But before all that, I want to share this conversation that I had with Mr. Broome a couple weeks ago. As usual, he's thoughtful and honest and just an overall good person. I hope that you like the interview as much as I did, and here it is. Brian Broome, thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you so much for having me. It's good to actually finally meet you and talk to you.
Yeah, last time we talked, I think it was just on the phone to talk about 79. Is that right? 2 or 3 years ago.
Yeah, it was a while ago. I was amazed that I was like, oh my God, somebody wants to talk to me about something I wrote. Oh my goodness. It was probably one of the first times that had happened to me. And then you told me that it was involved in your book club or you were teaching it or something like that. And I was just like, wow, I am super famous. But no, I was flattered and honored, and I'm happy to be here.
I mean, you joke about being famous, but the last 2 or 3 years, I don't know. I mean, isn't it different the last couple, 2 or 3 years? How do you feel from then to now about just how your work is being received?
Well, from then to now, I'm trying to think about how I remember then. Like then I was just glad to write something. I was glad that somebody paid me money for something that I wrote. 79, I still love 79, but I was just so happy, and I thought, well, this is great. Like I have it's a small book. It's what they call a chapbook. But I was extremely happy then, and I had no idea, that something bigger was coming. Like I literally had no idea. So from then to now, as far as the work is concerned, I think that I want to get bigger. Maybe explore some broader subjects, or maybe stick with the same subject matter and just tell it in different ways. But I feel like I can do more. I feel like I want to try more. I want to try maybe writing a piece of fiction or do some journalism. Like I feel like the writing is going to be the writing, but I feel like I have leeway now to try some different kinds of things.
First of all, I love 79 and I love this book. One of the biggest things that I see as the difference is like you're mostly an observer in 79 on the bus, and then you're observing everything that's around you. And then obviously here, you're the main character in Punch Me Up to the Gods. People probably are asking you about how it feels to write so personally. Was that a major challenge for you? Or because you have been writing on Facebook and just like with the moth and everything, did it sort of come naturally?
Well, I mean, the Punch Me Up to the Gods obviously gets more personal than, a lot of stuff, or most stuff, than that I've written. But, it's a weird thing. I honestly sometimes feel like I don't believe that anybody's going to read anything that I write anyway. So that was the process with Punch Me Up to the Gods. I would put down something that was extremely personal or embarrassing or unflattering to myself. And then I'd be like, oh, maybe I should take that out. That's a little too much. But then I would be like, nobody's going to read it anyway. So you may as well, just put it on the page. But then I found that putting those things on the page actually kind of lifted my burden a little bit. It felt like, well, geez, this is honest, but it's a terrible, like, sort of secret that's been weighing me down for a very long time. So putting it on the page sometimes just helped me personally, and then, the day before publication, I was like, oh my God, I should take all of this shit out. Like I have to take all of it out. But what's really gratifying is that after, Punch Me Up to the Gods came out, I heard from a lot of people. To my surprise, I am not the only one who has endured these kinds of embarrassments, or who has felt these kinds of, unsavory feelings like jealousy and, and being a liar, and, all these things. It's interesting. There's a story in the book about Luther Vandross, and, my mother's sort of reaction to him, and my reaction to him as well. And I actually had a man write to me and say that exact same thing happened to me. I couldn't believe it. I was like, really? He was like, yeah. And he was a straight man, And he was like, I really liked Luther Vandross. And my parents told me I couldn't, he was like that all well, it wasn't the exact same thing, but almost the exact same thing around the same, public figure. I had, there's a story called The Red Caboose in there as well. And I had somebody reach out to me and say that exact same scenario happened to me, only instead of with my mother, it happened with my father. So in putting those things out there, you do render yourself vulnerable, but it's also an opportunity to recognize that you're not alone as well. I thought I had, oh my God, I had endured all these hardships and the woe is me, but it's, a lot of people experience the same thing. And I was also surprised that so many different kinds of people were telling me these things, white women, saying I felt the same way, and Black women saying, oh, this happened to me too. The story about colorism.
Mhm.
So yeah, it was hard to do, but there are rewards.
Yeah, thank you for that because I didn't know which story to choose because I related just so strongly. Similarly, like, oh, this has happened to me, even though, I'm white and all that. But like, yeah, I was deciding between B and the Red Caboose. I'm looking through the book right now. This Gay Life and like I could have chosen, a lot of them,
Hmm.
but I finally landed on the Key just because there's just so much going on. And so, if it's okay, I would love to just talk a little bit about the Key. First, how you situate it in the book. So you have the famous poem by Gwendolyn Brooks, and then you decide to put the Key in the We Strike Straight part. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, the poem, Gwendolyn Brooks' poem is, first of all, a really great poem. I, discovered it late, and I was like, this has to be a part of my book. But, in a few lines, she sort of sums up these rites of passage for, Black men. And, the story is that she was walking by a pool hall, like, really sort of early in the day, when kids were supposed to be at school. And she looked inside, and there were seven, basically boys inside this pool hall, doing very, manly things, right? And playing pool and etc. And the We Strike Straight line in the poem, I believe, is just a reference to playing pool, and being the best at pool, which I sort of then extrapolated on. I'm like, well, this is sports, and I was horrible at sports. And then I use it again as a sort of metaphor for, trying to be heterosexual. But that's why I chose to put it under there, because my experience with, basketball or any sport for that matter was just an unmitigated disaster. And so that's why I decided to put it in that, under that heading.
And then also though, it's striking straight for the sports, but also you begin the piece in the bar and in the gay bar as well with Bertrand,
Yes.
which I have to say was intense from the second line, like the first or the second line, it gets right into it. And I'm gay and I've been in gay bars, but I have not been hit on in the same exact fashion as you describe in this piece. Can you take us? I mean, immediately he says, you must play basketball.
Yes.
And it seems like you're enamored a little bit because, he's got these eyes and, he has a sophistication and he's from Europe, I guess. But also you say that you're afraid right at the beginning when he says you must play back. Can you like say more about that?
Yeah, because he approached me that way, you know. First of all, he was beautiful. Like, and I was immediately, my first thought was, okay, he's clearly making a mistake, by even talking to me. He must be drunk or high or whatever. When it was clear to me that he wasn't crazy, I was like, well, there's only one reason that he is approaching me. It's the whole BBD thing, big black dick, like athletic, this sort of like, at the time, like Michael Jordan, fantasy. I had been there before. He wasn't the first person to want me to be, some sort of athletic fantasy. So I thought, well, if I don't play along, and also remember that I really thought I should have been these things at the time. So I thought if I don't play along, then he's not going to like me, and he's beautiful and he's sophisticated and he's smart, obviously. And so I need to be what he wants me to be. So, I just went into an act of pretending that I had been doing pretty much all my life, in one way or another. So yeah, I was scared that he was going to just turn around and be like, if you don't play basketball, I'm not remotely interested in you. Because there was no other reason in my mind that he would have been interested in talking to me.
You sort of were aware, obviously, because it wasn't your first time. But at that point, because this piece is also about the body and like your body, like at that time, so you had this idea, obviously, that he was going to be attracted to the notion. But like at that time, did you feel confident in your body at that time? Because in the basketball court later on, you're not.
No, I did not feel confident in my body. Like, I had been told that it was, I was young. I had been told that I had a good body, but that wasn't enough. You know, my body had to be athletic and it had to be graceful and it had to be able to do these amazing things like, like black sports gods bodies do. So, I had already been convinced that I was ugly from like an early age. So I was just desperate for somebody beautiful to like me, because that meant acceptance. That meant that I was beautiful too. So I wasn't confident in my body. I just lied like like a bearskin rug. I think I started lying, and I didn't really think it would ever come to anything, but it did in a spectacularly bad fashion. So no, I wasn't confident that in my body at all. It was all about what other people said. It was all about what other people told me I was.
Yeah, the lie also is pretty spectacular. It's almost like a movie. It's like such a performance,
Yeah,
almost like an outlandish. And then so was his response too about z racism.
yeah, the racism.
It's just absolutely ridiculous. It's like like so many parts of the book too. It's sort of like this happened, but did it really happen? Like it's just
Oh
like,
yeah,
yeah.
he was convinced, and I think back, like he was convinced that he was so sensitive to race and so race forward. And I remember him talking a lot of shit on like Americans. He'd be like, Americans, they do not know the racism. And he had been, growing up in Europe, reading about American racism, and he was like, the Americans, they are so stupid, but he was definitely racist, but just in this different way that he didn't ever seem to recognize as racism. It's like objectifying, sexualizing racism. And over the course of the time that we spent together, he said some ridiculously racist things, that didn't make it into the book. But I remember now, knowing what I know now and looking back at him, he was not as progressive, as he seemed to think he was.
Well, this is the thing also, is like he doesn't want you to exoticize him,
Right,
which makes you feel dumb instead of like anger. You know what I mean? Like
right.
what he doesn't want from, like, he does to you,
Yeah,
which is absolutely insane.
yeah.
um
I did not recognize that at the time. He was like, "Oh, the Americans, they treat me like exotic," and I was like, "Oh, that's a shame." And then and I remember he said exoticize, and I felt really dumb because I didn't know what that word meant. And throughout the course of the time that we spent together, it never dawned on me. Oh, he's doing the same thing to me, like that he complained about the first time that we met. Never dawned on me once.
yeah, I mean, obviously, like now we can reflect back, and he, like a lot of white people, is trying to be like the good white person. Did it help that he was European? Like, do you know what I mean? Like, so if this has happened to you many times, for you at that time, because of the sophistication, was he like not like another white person because like he had an extra vocabulary and like he lived in France or whatever?
I don't know. I don't know. I think that, and this, I'm going to sound so shallow right now, but I think that just because he was so like good looking. I felt like he was a better person. You know, I think we do that a lot with people who are good looking. We automatically assume that their emotions are more important. They're more important somehow. We get that a lot through our culture. Through television and film and print media. That good looking people are the most important people. And I bought that hook, line, and sinker. Like, so because he was just this, I actually stalked him a few weeks ago. I was like, I wonder if I could see what he's like up to. So I like typed his name into Google like a complete maniac. He's still good looking. But I think it was because just he was so striking, and we were in a bar full of men, and he chose me, and that made me feel like so outsized special that I was like, I can't lose this feeling. You know, I want to be him. I want to be part of him. And, I look back and recognize how crazy that was. But I mean, we all know how looks driven gay culture can be. And yeah, I was definitely that guy. Like, I wanted a good looking boyfriend because that meant that I was a good person or a better person.
Yeah. And so ultimately you're looking at the exit, but then you continue with the lie and you know that you're like what the next step is to go to his apartment. But before we go to the flashback, the one thing is that in addition to him being beautiful and everything, he also, and you note this right from the beginning, is that he has a prosthetic, which like I feel as a reader, I was like, oh, that's not just an important detail for what happened, but obviously about like what you're trying to say too. I guess it's just a basic question about the prosthetic, but yeah, why did you include it and what is it trying to do in the piece?
That's a good question. When I because I couldn't, the thing about it was like, okay, I wrestled with whether or not to put that in there because obviously it's a really identifying detail as to who this person is. Like if he read this, I don't know if he has, he would know exactly, who I'm talking about. But I had been, and you have to sort of think about who you were at the time. In all of these pieces, like I try to write as who I was at the time. I think at that time, if he had just been some guy, you know, who approached me and had a leg missing, it would have freaked me out, and I would have rebuffed them, or I would have, not at least not gone. But it was with him, it was merely incidental. you know it was something that could easily been overlooked because of what I wanted from him. But metaphorically speaking, there's a piece of him missing, that I chose to ignore. And I also chose to ignore his racism because of who he was, to me. And then obviously, we went and got into bed, and it wasn't a big deal. But in that moment, when I think back, I was like, I would have not gone home with just some guy who was, missing most of his leg. Like, this is how important it was to me to have proximity to beauty, but in a missing piece. And then there's a missing piece of his sort of like, interest in me as well. So those two things kind of like lined up. And that's why I decided to put it in the piece.
Yeah.
If that makes any sense at all.
No, it does, because like in your work, I feel like in your writing, you also are honest about what you want from the situation. So even though all this stuff is happening to you and it's very raw, and like you're aware also, and at least I am too as the reader, like you want something too, and you make choices as well about what you let go and all that too. So yeah, thank you for that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. You write so hilariously, even though it's painful, about sports and basketball. And let me tell you, like when you go into the phys ed, we call it PE out here. Basically, how you described like not being part of the game, sort of like going really slowly, not
Oh, yeah.
what like even though I was sort of okay at sport, I was totally there. But this wasn't just one time for you. This was like your childhood.
Oh, yeah.
And especially like you speak very frankly too about like, being a Black boy and then being under the gaze of other Black boys. So there's a lot of pain in all of the scenes, but specifically like that scene and in the locker room as well. How do you deal with like humor and pain in that scene and also in your writing?
Well, I mean, I think everybody has, moments that they look back on that were excruciating at the time. But you look back and you're like, that actually was kind of funny. So again, what I do, like when I'm writing something, is I try to get into the emotion of what I was feeling at the time, and then I just kind of free write, like, oh my god, it was excruciating, and then I sound really like emo when I write the painful parts, and then I do another take on it, which was like, okay, what was actually funny? Like just like there's physical comedy there, you know, that you have to take advantage of. It's almost Keystone cop comedy, so write that part too. And then just kind of smush them together, because, there's a lot of, you know, and you think about it, those moments are really great because you get to feel, in retrospect, because you get to feel two things at once, like that cringy, oh, that you can't help but laugh, like the church laugh, when you start laughing in church and you can't stop, and somebody keeps telling you to stop, and the more they tell you to stop, the more you laugh, like that to me is a great physical feeling, like this, with these two things battling against each other. So, I mean, when some things are just painful, and there's no comic spin that you can put on it, and some things are just funny. But, in those moments, at my advanced age, I can look back and I can laugh. So I want to bring the reader in with me. Like, come on, it's not so bad. You can laugh at this. Come on. You want to laugh with me.
Yeah, the basketball scene, I was laughing even though it was deep. You talk about the body again, shirts and skins. That's throughout the entire piece. You say that your body was a bully,
Mm,
which is interesting because it's in a scene about bullying, but that
yeah.
your body is a bully. And then also you say that your body swished, which is positive in basketball. Like we want things to like we
Yeah.
but for you, your body swished. I don't know, like that's intense. And I was laughing though until we got to the locker room scene. That's when it gets really serious too, because it also gets to like what you're noticing and not wanting to notice about like your body and your attraction and not wanting to look. All of a sudden it's not funny. Like
Yeah.
it was not funny. Like those scenes hopefully don't exist anymore, but when we were growing up they did, and they're just such horrible places of pain, whether or not like you're questioning or whatever,
Mm.
like because your whole thing is like you're talking about masculinity, you're talking about sexuality and the intersection, but like and in one point you talk about like they don't have any rules here. Like it's almost like Mr. Seifert or whatever his name was. Like it was almost like the whole institution was here to torment.
Yeah. That's exactly what it felt like. I remember, I think we had, I can't remember whether we had gym every day or like 3 times a week or like something like that. But I remember when that bell would ring and it was time to go to gym class, like on a daily or semi-daily basis, everything in my body would just collapse. It was like being sent to the galleys every day for me for, however long, gym was. And, Mr. Seifert was, the king of this sort of like torture chamber. And all the other boys were his minions. They took their notes a lot of times from him, because he couldn't, he openly laughed at me sometimes. And, the other boys were like, well, then it must be okay. But you talk about the Black boy gaze, it's a tremendous gaze to be under, because of racism. I think that oftentimes Black people start to believe that we are somehow responsible for each other, that this Black person's bad deed, somehow reflects on me. It is one of the many, many things that white supremacy in this country has done to make us feel like we're responsible for each other. It keeps us all in check. And one of those things was this idea of masculinity. If one of us was acting like a sissy, then all of us were acting like a sissy. And so therefore you have to, stomp the sissy out, or at least make it clear that you have you hate him too, because it felt like they didn't want the white boys to think the black boys were soft, and I was the soft one. So therefore I had to be ostracized, isolated, and, in a lot of ways, tortured to make it clear that I was not a part of black boy culture. Like, they all had it down. I went to a school where, I think if you were a black boy, education was not focused on, you were there to play sports and win for the Vikings. And that's what it felt like. And, my brother was very good at playing sports and winning for the Vikings. He's also really smart too, but that didn't matter, and that, I just felt trapped. I felt trapped all the time.
It's almost like the other black boys, who feel responsible, it's like a script almost. It's like, it's not like that they're necessarily like thinking to like try to squash you out or to hurt you, but it almost happens automatically in some ways. In the final and horrific scene, obviously on the bus, where you basically, this guy challenges you, it's almost like it's inevitable that this is going to happen. People could ask, oh, why didn't you fight back? Or why didn't your brother, fight back? Or whatever. But like, it's like, that is what happened because it happened, but it's almost like that's inevitable, that it's going to happen. So what was happening for you in that moment?
Yeah, yeah. What's interesting, I think, about that story is what happened, about a couple months ago when my brother called me. And he didn't say directly that he had read the book. My brother has 1,000 children now, and he's, very busy, and, and he's also a very religious man. So, there are places where we diverge, right? But he called me and he wanted me to know. Oh, no, he didn't call me. This is what happened. He sent me a text. I never get texts from my brother. He's not a texter. He texted me and he was like, I'm about to write you something. Please hold on. It's going to take a long time. And I was like, oh, shit. I do not know what this is going to be about. So, it did take a long time. Like, an hour and a half later, we get this long text where he pretty much says, like, look, I was going through the same thing. I was, my brother was in his own sort of battle with this idea of black masculinity. He was trying to keep, even though he was a sports star and he had, a lot of girlfriends and he was popular, he was also trying to keep his head above water on this masculinity piece, So he said, I'm sorry. But he didn't say it was specifically for anything, but I think that there were times where he didn't come to my aid because he was trying to save himself. That's how powerful it was, and still is to some extent. But again, he would never admit to reading my book. But I think that maybe he got wind of it, or maybe he did read it. But it was interesting for me to hear that he was going through the same thing.
Yeah, because I could feel on the bus how much you wanted him to help you out, and then how much he felt like he couldn't as well.
Yeah.
I don't have as much sympathy for this Glenn guy, but maybe he's going through some pain as well. But probably. The last two scenes, though, both on the bus as well as with Bertrand, where you perform basketball for him, like the line saying like you thought you were going to play with him, but you're like,
Yeah.
no, you're going to play for him.
Yeah.
Like, I was trying to figure out how they're similar because they are. And for me, like, the first word that came to me is humiliation. So you do this whole thing where you're playing basketball and the basketball becomes personified.
Yeah.
And it is like, it is your bully. You think the basketball is going to behave and then it doesn't, but you keep going. And then after that, you go to the Korean restaurant, and like you still, like, strangely to me, even like, and I can keep on going too, but like, did you still have hope that somehow?
Oh yeah, I still had hope. Like, on some level too, like, I say in the piece, like, I really strongly believed that this sort of black basketball playing gene would like spring to life under duress. You know how X-Men, like they have to undergo some sort of stress for their powers to, to come into effect. Like that's what I felt, like maybe if enough pressure, if this beautiful man puts enough pressure on me, like my ability to play basketball will spring to life. And while I was performing basketball for him, I I honestly didn't know that I looked as ridiculous as I did. Like, I honestly didn't. Like, it was only kind of like after when I saw the horror, on his face, just the utter, thorough disappointment and embarrassment on his face that it dawned on me like, oh God, I must have looked ridiculous. But then, even though he was crestfallen, even though he was just like, oh, I could tell that he just didn't want to be around me anymore. I still went to the Korean place with him and still was trying to keep him, to try to bring him back in. He never talked to me again after that. I was still trying to, but the interesting thing for me at the end when he left is that I started drinking like immediately. I went straight to the bar and I sat there for a long time and I got drunk and then I went down to the clubs later that night. I mean, how symbolic, I couldn't be this thing that this guy wanted me to be. And so now I'm going to go out and just destroy myself.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a pattern, for me for a very, very long time.
Yeah, you go out to destroy yourself after that, but then back after the bus, you decide to destroy, in the last scene, you decide to destroy a worm.
Yeah.
And you also say, I had to tell myself the truth. Why then do you feel?
Why then? I just, that's a good question. That's probably one for my therapist. In that moment, like, I had worm guts on my hand and I was sort of like wanting that worm. It was the only power that I had, in that moment was to destroy something that was smaller than me and couldn't defend itself. But I think after Glenn's exposing me like that, it had just all come to a head. And when my brother didn't defend me, I was like, well, just literally nobody wants me. And I guess it was just one of those childhood like epiphanies. For right or wrong, I was like, well, it's just time to be this pariah now. And that's kind of, I think that's in that moment, I just was like, well, what are you going to do about this? I recognized it myself, but I still, of course, for much longer after that, just continued to hide it that I was gay.
Well, that's the thing, though. You just said, you basically accepted your pariahness, not that necessarily this was a coming outness.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting because, like, not to go too much into me, but like, I've heard that sometimes with coming out, it's almost sort of like there's a coming out when it becomes more painful not to come out. And
Mm-hmm.
so I thought that this was your moment of coming out, but like, no, it's like to accept. So can you say, what are you truly accepting at the end of this chapter?
At the end of that chapter, I am accepting that I am, useless, gay, not necessarily in that order, that I am a mistake. I'm not coming out in that moment. I'm coming out to myself as something that is false. I am accepting things that aren't true. That's why, the worm ends up crushed in my hands, because I want to hurt somebody. And I'm too timid to try to hurt other people. I don't think I have the power to do that in that moment. So why not the worm? Yeah, I accepted that, I'm probably gonna die either by somebody else's hand or my own. I just accepted all the horrible stereotypes about gayness in that moment, sitting on the steps of my family's house. And then every day after that was just really difficult. And I found ways to feel better, in quotes. As soon as I found drugs and alcohol, I was like, well, this is what I've been missing. This is what it's all about. This is how I can feel better. So yeah, I think that all began on those steps.
Mm-hmm. it just seems so intensely grim, but there was an acceptance because this book, the whole book, is dedicated in some ways to Tuan. Like, what sort of message are you then sending to him at the end of this, at the end of the key?
Well, the book, the whole message to him is a different message than the message at the end of the key. I think the message at the end of the key is just how low other people can drag you down, if you give them too much power over you. Mr. Seifert, the boys in the gym class, my brother, even though maybe unintentionally, just how low they can bring you when I don't want to sound like an after school special, don't believe in yourself, or you just start to believe the bullshit they feed you, right? All of these things, all of these ways in which people torture you and bully you because of who you are simply ways for them to make themselves feel like they belong more. you know it's a zero-sum game with these people. You cannot belong in the way that you are, and me the way that I am, in this tiny little you know you know myopic universe I've built for myself. So I didn't know that at the time. And the lesson to Tuan is like, you should know that this is what people are capable of, and that you should try to surround yourself with people who do not have this binary view of the world, wherein they can't exist and be important, and you can't exist and be important at the same time.
Thank you. Like, people say that I tend to go for the serious, and so like like we definitely went there,
Oh, I
in
love
this.
it.
And yeah, I mean, I love it too. Like, we could also talk for another whole hour on just how funny and hilarious, the book is too. But the most important thing that I just want to say to you is thank you. I'm so grateful. I thought, like, when we talked, a couple years ago, I was like, oh, this guy, like, he really knows how to write, and like, you've done it again. So just thank you so much for the time. Thank you for the book. Thank you for this chapter. Just much appreciation.
Oh, you're very welcome. It was my pleasure. When I heard from you, I was like, I have to talk to this guy because he gets me. But no, thank you. I'm honored to be here. You're very welcome, Mark.
I want to thank Brian Broome once again for his book, for this chapter, and for taking the time to answer our questions at Article Club. There's a chance that he's going to be coming to our discussion next Sunday, too, which is very, very generous. But until then, thank you for listening, and thank you for being part of Article Club, and I hope you have a good week ahead.